right, we've got a few people already coming in. Alan, Cherie, Chris, some of my people here at the coalition. Okay. Off to a good start here. 11 participants so far. Hello, everybody. There's Tony. Recognize these names. Good to see my friends of many years. All right, people are saying their hellos in the chat.
Fantastic. Hello to all of you as well.
All right, we'll give a few more minutes for people to get logged in and for computers to catch up with where we are. Hi, Randy. Good to see so many familiar names in here. Some folks I've known and worked with for a long time. Some people are newer to me. Just means it's a good mix of participants. We'll wait a couple more minutes. Looks like we've got about 16 people so far. I think if, as the presentation goes along, if you have questions, put them in the chat or raise your hand, use those functions, and then I can, unmute you. We'll try that.
And feel free to ask anything along the way. You don't have to save any questions for the end.
All right, we'll wait one more minute. Tony, I believe we are all muted. You had asked the question. All right, let's get this party started then. And I officially want to welcome everybody to the community table sponsored by Anthem, who makes these trainings available for us. And Today we have Rachel Toll from the Center for Women and Families, who's going to talk to us about domestic violence and people who are experiencing homelessness. So Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and get things going for us?
All right. Well, I am Rachel. I work at the Center for Women and Families, so I just started there in January. My main job responsibility is doing presentations like this. I am a Louisville native. Technically grew up a little bit outside of the city, but I consider myself a Louisville native, and I live in the city now. I went to Bellarmine for my undergrad, and I let's see, anything else important about me? Um, I have a dog that I love dearly who just turned 4 yesterday. Go Knights! I saw that in the chat. Yep, go Knights. So I will share my screen and get started here. Y'all will have to give me a little bit of grace. I am newer to Zoom. I'm going to make sure that I shared it with audio. Yep, shared with audio. Okay, there we go. Okay. So my official title at the center is Prevention and Outreach Coordinator. Excuse me. And what that means is that I go out and do presentations in the community. I also do presentations with students in the school system. We have state-sponsored programs that work on boundaries and healthy relationships and bystander training, preventing dating violence, bullying, and sexual assault. So those are our middle and high school programs, respectively. But I also come out and do presentations in the community. I do shorter presentations like this that just give folks an overview, and longer presentations that are trainings that have skill building components. So have some practice time built in. We'll do a couple of little activities today, but those trainings are a little bit longer because there are longer activities included. So I work on those things. I also do tabling and just like awareness activities for folks out in the community, getting our name out there and making sure that people know about the work that we do so that they can use our resources and our services, and so that they can recommend or refer anyone in their life or in their professional career that they know needs our services or would benefit from them. So that's a little about what I do. I will tell you all some more about the center during our presentation, so I won't go too much into that now, but that's a little about me on a personal and professional level. So we are going to talk about, if my little clicker will work, there we go, intimate partner and sexual violence today. So just going over our agenda real quick, we are going to do some introductions. That part is done. I just introduced myself to you all. I introduced you to a little bit about what I do and who I am. So that part is finished. Pat yourselves on the back. We got through goal number 1. We're going to discuss intimate partner and sexual violence. That's what the acronym IPSV stands for. There will be multiple different acronyms that I use during the presentation, and that's the most important one. You don't have to remember all of them, but if you do take one away, that's the most important one. So intimate partner and sexual violence. And I'll say that a couple of times, but we're going to discuss the statistics and the prevalence, get a better understanding for these things, how frequently they're happening, unfortunately, and just how prevalent they truly are. We're going to discuss the relationship dynamics, what this might look like. We're going to go over a wheel that has some different dynamics on there, and we're going to discuss the risks of staying versus leaving in one of these abusive relationships. We're going to do a little activity based around that, so you all will get to participate a little bit. And we're also going to discuss supporting survivors, what that looks like, how we can support them without victim blaming or shaming narratives. And finally, we're going to end discussing the services that we have at the center. CWF is us. That's another little acronym I'm going to use in the presentation. But CWF, or the center, is just the Center for Women and Families. Going to discuss our services, what we can offer folks. And oftentimes we have a little bit more than what people typically know about us. So might expand your all's knowledge of what we offer. So our objectives or our goals for today, just what we hope that you all take away. I'm also going to say the word we a lot in the presentation. I'm used to co-facilitating with someone else. We is just the word I'm probably going to end up using a lot. So we, me, the center in general. We hope that you develop an understanding and empathy for survivors of IPSV, or if not develop, that it increases and intensifies what you already have. Discuss the risks of staying and leaving an abusive relationship and better understand those risks as well. And finally, just increase awareness around CWF and our services, what we can offer, and how we can be the best community partner to you all. So our expectations for our time together is that you all participate, if at all possible. I know being virtual is a little bit more of a challenge than it is being in person, where I can like stare you all down and say, come on, give me an answer to this question. But please participate. It makes my job a lot easier and it makes our presentation a lot better for everyone. If you have something to say or something to ask, there's probably someone else who's thinking the same thing. So if you share, it's probably going to help someone else. So I appreciate when y'all participate. Participate looks like if you're a person who typically shares a lot or typically is the first one to speak, stepping back and making a little bit of space for those who like to think or process before they're ready to answer a question or maybe put a comment out there. And if you are that person who takes a little longer and maybe wants to process before stepping up and sharing, then we encourage you to grow a little bit and maybe get out of your comfort zone and step up first. So we call that our take space, make space rule. Take a little bit more space if you typically don't, and make a little bit more space if you're typically taking space. So both are opportunities for growth and for getting out of our comfort zones. We also just encourage you all to be one person talking at a time. That is usually not a problem in the virtual setting and not often a problem in real life either, but that is fantastic just to have one person talking. All of your voices matter and are important. So I want to hear each one of you individually. We also have an expectation around, we call it confidentiality. That sounds kind of official. What we really mean by that is what is learned in this space should leave this space, but what is shared in this space should stay here. So sometimes we also call this our Vegas style rule, you know, what happens here stays here. But there might be some personal stories, anecdotes, maybe stories about clients or people you all have worked with that come out while we're talking about these issues. They are unfortunately very prevalent and things that a lot of us have been touched by either directly or indirectly. And those stories or personal things just shouldn't be shared outside of this space. Again, everyone is adults here, and that is, you know, something that we already expect of each other, but just reinforcing that a little bit. And finally, this is the most important one. This is why we put it at the end. Trauma is very prevalent. We are going to talk more about statistics and prevalence, understanding not only how important this kind of trauma is, you know, intimate partner and sexual violence, which is only a small fraction of the types of trauma that people can experience. And we already know just how prevalent that is. So trauma of all kinds is really prevalent, and we want you all to take care of yourself in this space. We really encourage you to step away if you need to, or do a grounding exercise, fidget, especially in a virtual space. You're free to do a lot more that isn't distracting to anyone around you. So please take care of yourselves and do whatever you need to do. And we hope that this is a space where everyone feels able to be safe and brave. So with that, I'm going to go over a little bit about the center, and then I will touch more on the center at the end of the presentation. But our mission at the center is together we disrupt the cycle of intimate partner and sexual violence. And the vision that we have for the work that we do is thriving survivors and safe communities. So this is the backbone of everything that we do. So now we're going to jump into content. Also, if at any point I will remind you all, if you have anything, I am able to see a little chat bubble, so I think I should be able to maybe see the chat, perhaps. But if you all have anything that you need to say or that you want to ask, you can feel free to jump in at any time and ask your questions. You can also save them for the end, but either way works for me. So we're going to jump into content here. Intimate partner violence is what we're going to talk about first. It is also called domestic violence sometimes. The terms are used pretty interchangeably, but intimate partner violence is a little more inclusive term. It can Domestic violence can have the connotation of, number one, something that's happening in the home, which intimate partner violence is not always people who are cohabitating. It also can have the connotation of a straight or heterosexual relationship, which intimate partner violence is a little more broad in that definition. And domestic violence also legally and statistically can be tied up sometimes with violence that's happening with like family members who are cohabitating. So intimate partner violence focuses specifically on intimate partners, so those who are in romantic and sexual relationships with each other. So it's a little more inclusive term, but domestic violence is also a term that will be used kind of interchangeably throughout this presentation as well. So intimate partner violence is like the best practices term, but domestic violence is okay as well. So intimate partner violence, as we define it for our purposes, is a pattern of behaviors used by one person in a relationship to gain and then maintain power and control over the other person. So your all's first audience participation question here is, can you give me a word or a phrase from this definition that stands out to you that seems like it's kind of the crux of what we're getting at here? Like maybe a really important word or phrase. No wrong answers. And you can drop those in the chat, or you can maybe raise your hand and get unmuted. Yeah, power and control. Absolutely. I can see that in the chat there. Pattern. Yeah, for sure. Anyone else have anything? I like to give people a second because when you're putting stuff in the chat, you have to type. Yep, I agree with power and control. Yeah. 2 votes for power and control. Fantastic. All right. Yeah, so power and control and pattern are what we have. Those are absolutely the things that we would like to highlight in this definition. So intimate partner violence being a pattern, not just a one-off thing that happens at one time, but a pattern of behaviors being used by one person in the relationship, and then gaining and maintaining that power and control. So power and control are the biggest thing that we want to highlight when we're talking about intimate partner violence. That is what the abusive partner is trying to gain and trying to maintain at all costs. So we will, after we discuss statistics, I want you all to hold power and control in your heads because that's going to come back later in just a second. We're going to discuss the power and control wheel and what some of those dynamics look like, but you all hit the mark. Absolutely. Power and control and being a pattern. So we're going to discuss a few statistics. Before I share them, I want you all to know, first of all, that these are possibly triggering statistics. They're pretty disheartening, unfortunately, how prevalent intimate partner violence is. So please take care of yourselves. And if you think this content might be triggering, feel free to step away for a few minutes. And also, I want you all to be thinking while I'm sharing these statistics about maybe which one sticks out to you or which one kind of hits with you, and tell me a little bit about why. I will find my mouse again. There it is. Okay. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. Domestic victimization is correlated with a higher rate of depression and suicidal behavior. And only 34% of those who are injured by an intimate partner receive medical care for their injuries. So I'd like you all to tell me a little bit about which one of these sticks out to you. You can just, if you want to put it in the chat, you can just say the first one or the second one or whatever. But tell me a little bit about why it sticks out to you and kind of what stands out, if you will. Yeah, the last one and how that would affect health long term physical and mental. Absolutely. Physical and mental health are a really big component of this. Yeah, absolutely. Long-term effects. 34% receive medical care, indicates a culture of silence. Yeah, culture of silence, a lot of burying these kinds of issues and not talking about them. So that's part of what I love about my job, and part of what the center tries to do is raising awareness, not only about us and our services, but also about these issues. Yeah. How common these situations occur, yet how low the percentage of medical attention is. Yeah. That seems like the one that people are seeing the most, sticking out to y'all the most. 1 in 4 men, culture of silence for them as well. Why do we think that that is? What do we mean when we say culture of silence for men? I'm gonna like push a little bit on that. Say more. Give y'all some time to type. Yeah, shame. Absolutely. IPV carries a stigma for both genders, but more so for men. Absolutely. Toxic masculinity prevents men from being victims of women. Absolutely. When we're looking at our heterosexual partnerships, especially, we have a lot more messages about gender roles and who can be an abuser. That's something that police and authorities also have kind of baked into their minds and the way they've been socialized, which means that a lot of times men are afraid of being seen as the abuser whenever they try to report. Absolutely. A lot of people think men can't be abused. Fear. Absolutely. Yeah. So we will talk some more about that in a minute, but fantastic responses to our statistics here. And very, very good. Okay. So something that kind of fits into this really well is the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship are when leaving an abusive relationship. So, in the process of leaving, just after the relationship has ended. So, when we say just after, we're thinking of like 24 to 72 hours range, kind of. And when one partner is pregnant. So, I would like you all to tell me a little bit about why you think these might be the most dangerous times. And when we say most dangerous, we mean most risk for physical harm and death. Why might these be the most dangerous? Absolutely. Hitting the nail on the head when the abuser fears their loss of power the most. The first two could be seen in light of grief stages, so anger and denial. That is a really interesting interpretation. I think you're absolutely right there, but that is kind of some outside of the box thinking. I really like that. Yeah. Yeah, so grieving the relationship ending and possibly grieving their loss of control, loss of power. Absolutely. What about when one partner is pregnant? Oh, yes. I read a statistic one time that said the number one cause of death for pregnant women is homicide by their partners. That is absolutely true. That is a statistic that we usually bring up during this conversation. Very, very unfortunate to find out, but the number one cause of death for pregnant women is homicide by an intimate partner. That is the highest cause of death above any kind of pregnancy complication, above any other kind of non-pregnancy related health issues like heart disease or other leading causes of death in the US. So number one cause of death for pregnant women. Yeah. Why do we think that that is? What do we think that pregnancy might be triggering? Hmm. It might give the mother more reason to leave. Okay. I'd like to hear more about that. And I know you all are a little bit limited in like how fast you can type and what you can type. Anyone who wants to raise their hand and like speak a little bit is more than welcome to. I do not want to have to be the one talking the whole time, so please go for it. So maybe more on why it gives the mother more reason to leave. Like she wants a better life from the kid for the kid away from the abuser. Yeah, that could certainly be a reason. Insecurity or doubt on if the child is theirs potentially. That is also absolutely a factor. Very possessive, controlling partners might feel that way and might lash out at the partner. We will discuss at possibly toward the end the LAP screening, which is the metric that we use to determine what amount of danger someone is in when they call us to see if they need to come into shelter or like what their options are. And one of the things that increases their risk of danger is if the person who's being abused has children who are not biologically related to the abuser, because that is a loss of control that brings other people into the family life. And that is really triggering for an abuser. Absolutely. Better life, or could be scared of the partner hurting or harming the child. And the abuser sees more responsibility. Yeah, these are all very true. So, one of the main reasons that pregnancy is a triggering time that has not been mentioned yet is a person being pregnant means oftentimes that they are out of the house more. They are going to doctor's appointments and checkups. Yeah, maybe pregnant people have more medical needs and their abuser can't handle that. That could also be true. Definitely like poverty and lack of resources being a stressor for a pregnant person, and also maybe more needs in a lot of different areas, so not just medically, yeah, but more needs in general. But a big reason why pregnancy is a triggering time is because someone is out of the house more than they normally would be. Doctor's appointments and checkups that are including a provider asking them how things are at home. And the person may also have more of a tendency to protect their body. They might have a higher sense of bodily autonomy, which again can be triggering for the abuser because they are losing their sense of power and control over that person's body. So there are a lot of things that we will let slide when they happen to us, but if our body is being shared by someone we care about, then at that point we feel a little higher sense of protecting the unborn life. So, or we may. So that could absolutely be a factor as well. So you all did a fantastic job of telling me what you think those risks are for pregnant folks and for folks who are leaving a relationship. So y'all hit the nail on the head, highlighting power and control as the biggest pieces of those dangerous times. And now we're going to talk a little bit about power and control, how it manifests, and what those relationship dynamics really look like. So we have our power and control wheel here that has the dynamics of an abusive relationship. So those are emotional abuse, physical abuse, using privilege, using finances, sexual abuse, using children, using intimidation, and using isolation. Now, isolation is often the first red flag in one of these relationships. Extreme sense of possessiveness that leads to isolating someone away from family and friends and claiming that the abuser should be the most important person in the person who's being abused lives. So these dynamics can all be going on in a relationship. There can only be sometimes only one of them is going on, but that doesn't make the relationship any less abusive, any less damaging for the person who is being abused, and it doesn't make that person any less worthy of seeking out help and resources for their situation. So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, and we probably understand kind of what they mean, especially when we have the wheel here. It does tell us a little bit in detail about these, but the one that we usually hear being the least easy to understand is using privilege. So I'd like someone to tell me their interpretation of what using privilege might mean, or give me a guess. absolutely no wrong answers, and you can also cheat off of the little sheet that we have there, and I won't tell anybody, but give me a guess on what using privilege might mean. Either put it in the chat or you can unmute if you. So a little about what we think using privilege might mean. And this one might be a little longer of a response, so you all can have a minute to type that out. Everything is given to them. I would like to hear more about what that might mean. The outdated but still prevalent stigma of hysteria and hysterical women. Okay. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So maybe using some messages that we have about gender to enforce those authority or to maybe discredit someone else. Absolutely. Yeah, that is a great example of using privilege. A lot of these can intertwine with one another as well. So intimidation, emotional abuse, using privilege can all be tactics that are employed in maybe one argument or big blow up. So a lot of these can intertwine as well. They are not concrete concepts. They are a lot more fluid than that. So yeah, absolutely. That is an example of using privilege. What other ways could someone use privilege? Or give me some other thoughts on what that might mean or look like in practice. Ooh, using a socioeconomic status to degrade a partner, having more money and using that against someone to control finances and spending. Relationship to law enforcement. Absolutely. Okay, those are great points that I'm gonna. The benefit of having people speak out is that I can like talk to each one individually. But yeah, absolutely. When things come in the chat, I'm gonna take them in sequence. So using socioeconomic status and using being the partner who maybe makes more money to control financial spending and finances absolutely is an example of using privilege. It's also using financial abuse. So that can most certainly be a way that someone takes power and control away. Relationship to law enforcement is a great thing to bring up, especially when we're thinking of folks who one or both members of the relationship are someone from a marginalized community that rightfully so doesn't have trust in authority, especially law enforcement. So that is absolutely a way that someone could hold power over someone else by saying, there's no one that you trust that you can tell. If you tell the police, they will not believe you or they will impose some kind of violence against you. That is absolutely a way of leveraging, especially someone's social statuses against them in order to continue abusing someone in a relationship. Yeah. Using religion, very, very, very true. Very good point. And I like what the next individual says in the chat too. Traditional patriarchal gender roles can be framed as either privilege or responsibility for males. Unfortunately, in many conservative groups, men emphasize the concept of privilege. Yeah, so I like what we're bringing up here that patriarchal gender roles can be framed as a responsibility or as like a duty to the family. And that could be a way of using someone's social status against them. But oftentimes when a like male or masculine person is the abuser, using those patriarchal gender roles to weaponize them against the other partner, typically a like female person, if we're thinking confines of like traditional gender roles and relationship expectations. Yeah, that is absolutely a way that someone can use power and using their privilege and their social status against someone else. On the other side, men may not be believed as much if their perpetrator is, for example, small in stature and not believed to be capable of abuse. So, yeah, that is also another way of using a social status or using something that other people can see and pick up on about us as a way to weaponize that against the person who is being abused. Yeah. Don't want to give up the lifestyle they become accustomed to, wealth, fame, or status. Absolutely. So, manipulating and abusing someone to keep privilege can be, I like that as well. And that can also intersect with financial abuse and other kinds of like emotional abuse and intimidation. Using those tactics to maintain a relationship with someone for the benefits of what that person can bring, the status, the money. Absolutely. These are fantastic responses. So, when we say using privilege, again, you all hit the nail right on the head, but just to refresh, using any kind of social status or anything that one partner might have that the other one doesn't to impose those manipulation, intimidation tactics and to maintain the power and control. So, as we've said before, power and control is really at the crux of abusive relationships, and that is what we're looking at here. Okay. So, any of those dynamics can be going on in a relationship. There may only be one of them, it may be all of them. But regardless of how many of those pieces of the pie are happening, they're not happening all at the same time. So, in abusive relationships, we have what's known as the cycle of violence, which starts as every relationship does in the honeymoon period. So, just like you might think of any relationship that you've had in your life or that you've seen folks experience or in media, perhaps, starts out, everything is great and wonderful. There's a lot of sweet words and gestures being shared, maybe even gifts that are being exchanged between people. And it's the part of the relationship where folks get to know each other, start to trust each other, and start to take down some of their walls and really start to feel like, everything is great and they're really optimistic about the relationship. But in abusive relationships, this cycles into the tension building phase, which is where there starts to be a lot of nitpicking and criticizing coming from the abusive partner in the direction of their partner they're abusing. There starts to be a lot of little fights or arguments, just kind of these little spats that seem like they're happening over nothing. There might be criticism about the way that one person is keeping the house or how late they're coming home from work every day, little small things. And the big hallmark of the tension building phase is for the person being abused, they're kind of confused. They don't know what changed. They don't know why their partner is starting to critique and nitpick them all the time. And they're not really sure what happened. They want to go back to how things were. And the tension building phase will escalate and will get continually worse until it moves into the explosion or the incident. A lot of people assume that this is a physical incident, but abuse does not have to be physical to be abuse. And this incident doesn't have to be physical either. So it could be a physical incident, it could be hitting someone, or it could be an incident of sexual abuse, like sex without consent. But it could also be a fight where someone employs unhealthy tactics like emotional abuse, name calling, intimidation, that we know are not healthy ways to disagree with a partner in a relationship. It could be taking away something like a partner's access to bank accounts, taking a partner's name off of a car or an asset. It could be forcing the partner to quit their job. It could be intimidation or threats to the children or the pets in the household, or maybe roommates or other family members, depending on what the household situation looks like. So the explosion or the incident can look really different. It can encompass any of the types of abuse that are very varied and diverse that can make up what an abusive relationship looks like. But you know it when you see it. And the way that you know this incident when you see it is because it cycles immediately back into the honeymoon phase. So the partner who exploded and caused the incident, the abusive partner will start to apologize. They'll start to share a lot of those kind words and gifts again. They'll probably say things like, I will never do that again. I just lost my temper. I've been stressed at work, etc. Make excuses for themselves. And what this honeymoon period is all about is trying to gain the person who's being abused trust again so that they can cycle right back into the tension building phase and eventually it leads to another incident. This cycle is not on any kind of timetable, so all three of these could happen in one day, or each of these phases could take several months or years even to be in before they cycle into the next one. So we know that this is what violence looks like in a relationship, but it's very diverse and varied, someone's experience in their relationship. So now this is my little break time. I get to be quiet for a few minutes and I want to hear from you all about, we're going to discuss the risks of staying and leaving in an abusive relationship. So what the negative consequences might be, the factors that someone might think about when they're trying to decide whether to stay or leave. And the best way to do this in the virtual setting we have found is just shouting these out in the chat. So I am going to let you all tell me the risks of staying first. So negative consequences someone might experience staying in an abusive relationship, things that they might be thinking about. So give me some risks of staying, please. Feel free to put those in the chat as you think of them. Continued abuse, death. Yeah, death is one that you all will be surprised how many times people miss that one. Yeah, death and continued abuse. What else? Continuing to be abused, escalation of the abuse, and harm to children. Absolutely. Eviction and CPS involvement. So that's a much more material concern for sure. But our access to safe shelter is a bedrock of our needs as a person. So absolutely a very important thing that people are thinking about. Harm to pets. Yeah, that's a really important one too. And that's something that a lot of people do not think about or are dismissive of, but absolutely that can happen and it can be very damaging. Continued abuse and declining mental health, depression, anxiety, and isolation. Absolutely. So, highlighting some mental health components, highlighting physical health or continuation of abuse, death. Then we're also talking about children and pets, less access to family members and friends. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the first things that happens in an abusive relationship, one of the kind of trademark signs that things are not okay, is when the partner starts to isolate their other partner from family and friends, getting really jealous and possessive, controlling where they go or who they're with at all times. Absolutely. Less access to people, and it can make it more difficult in the future if someone does decide to leave, not having those resources anymore, not having their support network or their community as much. Yeah. So that is absolutely a factor. What else can we think of when we think of risks of staying? Losing confidence and selfhood. So, like our perception of ourselves, how we think of ourselves. A lot of times, one of the things abusers are best at is taking someone's self-confidence and just making it absolutely plummet. Changing people's opinions of themselves to the point that they feel that they have to rely completely on the abuser and they wouldn't be able to even make it on their own. So, yeah, long-term trauma that can cause mental health issues. That's something that we go into a lot more in our longer presentations for service providers, but absolutely long-term trauma affects the brain. It can cause mental health issues. It can also cause physical health issues. So the effects of being in fight or flight mode, having the raised cortisol levels and all the stress that it brings to our body is something that oftentimes, according to one of the leading trauma scientists, I will not try to pronounce his name, but the author of The Body Keeps the Score, we show a little video from him, and he says oftentimes the physical effects last even longer than some of the mental and emotional effects of trauma. Absolutely, that is for sure a risk of staying. Do we have any other risks of staying? Maybe in the realm of someone's opportunities, maybe thinking about community, other effects to children or family members. Yeah, may cause a person to become suicidal or have thoughts of suicide. Absolutely, that is a risk. That fits into a lot of mental health issues, which are very real. And unfortunately happen to the vast majority of folks in these kinds of relationships for sure. Yeah. Loss of education, employment, and overall potential, cutting off connections with family, friends, and loss of employment. Yeah. So, loss of education and employment, that's a really great point to bring up that when someone's life is being completely controlled by someone else, they might not have the opportunities that they would have had, or they might not be able to access those opportunities in the way that they would have if they weren't under that person's control. Yeah. And thinking about when someone possibly chooses to leave a relationship, what their life might look like after if they were restricted from getting their education, from getting employment opportunities, maybe forced to stay in the home when they didn't want to, and what that looks like on their resume and how that impacts their opportunities going forward. Yeah. So, overall potential, I really like that. Yeah. And then cutting off connection with family and friends, absolutely. That isolation and loss of community also makes it a lot more difficult to leave, and an abuser knows that. That's why they ensure isolation, because it makes it so much more difficult to leave. Or if there are children in the home, may cause behavioral problems at school or become abusive toward their siblings. Absolutely. Yeah. So normalizing abuse for children and maybe having them lash out at other people, hurting others, for sure. So children are unfortunately very impressionable in these kinds of situations. So give me some risks of leaving now. So risks of negative things that might happen if someone chooses to leave. Death. Okay. Absolutely. Loss of stable housing, supportive neighbors, moving expenses. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially for folks who are not having as many resources, might be from disadvantaged communities or backgrounds. Housing is a need for humans. And if we can't ensure our housing, it is really difficult to focus on literally anything else. Our mental health, our relationships are all higher levels of our little pyramid of needs. Housing is foundational, absolutely. Slander and judgment. Yeah. So some of that backlash from someone, maybe even blackmail, judgment from people in the community, judgment from religious community could be a big part of it as well, or just more traditional folks who stigmatize things like divorce or leaving relationships. Having to restart. Yeah. So the fear of the unknown. Oftentimes folks feel, as backwards as it might sound, or as kind of confusing as it might sound to us, it might feel safer for our brains to be in a familiar yet abusive situation than to be in an unfamiliar yet not abusive situation. So the unknown is really scary for us. Yeah. Loss of social network and community, and then having to rebuild that network and community on top of the difficulty of leaving a partner and leaving everything that someone has known. Leaving behind belongings or important documents, absolutely. That's especially important for folks who are immigrants. Having nowhere to go or anyone to stay with due to them being isolated to that one person for so long. Absolutely. That ties back into our loss of community for sure. Loss of childcare, that's absolutely a big part of it too. Also, just having to uproot children, move schools, and that kind of thing. And oftentimes, once again, this is something that may not sound right to us, but sometimes people in these situations get in the mindset that it's better for their children to be in an abusive two-parent household than to be in a safe and loving one-parent household. Often due to a lot of messaging that we have about like what a family should look like. So, yeah, oftentimes people feel that children are barriers to leaving for sure. This might feel like love to them. Absolutely. So folks still feel love for their abuser oftentimes. They would not be in or get in a relationship in the first place if they didn't have some kind of love or like positive regard for that person. So oftentimes the version of that person that they see during the honeymoon phase is the one that sticks. They might make excuses for the behavior that happens in those tension building and incident phases and say that they were just stressed. It's not who they really are. And the person that they love is still there deep down. So, absolutely, it might feel like love and like a loss of love for sure. Loss of health insurance. Absolutely. So some of those material things that are really important to our health and safety that are huge concerns for us when leaving a situation. So you all did a fantastic job on this little exercise. Very good, deep responses. Yeah, scared of abuser gaining custody of the children if taken to court, where power and control are. Thank you for highlighting power and control. Absolutely. Yeah, especially in relationships that do not follow maybe the societal model of what people think of when they think of like a heterosexual pairing. Oftentimes, if the person who's abusing someone else is a woman, it's a lot easier for women or like assigned female at birth people to get custody of children. So the fear of children being in the sole custody of an abuser and what an abuser might do to the children if the person decides to leave the relationship, absolutely. Fear of being with an abuser who is worse. Yeah, and just normalizing abuse. Sometimes people say to themselves, this is just what a relationship looks like. And if I leave this person and go with someone else, it's going to be the same. A lot of people don't even realize that abuse is not normal and it shouldn't be normalized. So, you all did a fantastic job with this exercise. I want you all to tell me before we move on, what are some of the similarities and differences we see between the risks of leaving and staying? Usually we have these lists up on a big, like we have each one on a big piece of poster paper so we can kind of see them, but scroll up in the chat if you need to and tell me a little bit about, let's compare and contrast. What about the overall amount of risks that we have discussed for each of these? Does it feel like one has more or one has less? Hmm. Yeah, commonalities are death and loss. Absolutely. So risk of death happens in both. Loss of a lot of different things, loss of relationships, loss of children, loss of love, loss of housing. Yeah, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it can also depend on the situation. That's absolutely true. So for some people, their risks of leaving might have more weight. They might be things that are more important to them or things that have more of a grave concern when it comes to their livelihood. It depends on the way that the abuser has threatened them in the past, and their knowledge of like that person's capabilities. So genuinely in some situations it is far safer to leave versus others. So yeah, that's a great point to bring up, that it is very situationally dependent. More long-term risks of staying versus the healing journey of leaving. That is an awesome thing to bring up. It is worthwhile to say that the way that human brains work in terms of trying to find what is the safest for us in the moment, and maintaining our survival, means that it is a really hard hump to get over to leave an abusive partner when it feels like that could be, and it is, such a big risk to our safety, to our livelihood. So absolutely, it is a long-term decision that can lead to a lot more healing and growth for a person, but it's also really, really difficult to get over that hump of leaving. And it takes a person who's being abused 7 to 9 times on average to leave an abusive partner for good. That's a lot of times, but the more that we look at these risks of leaving, the more we understand why someone might come back or might be afraid to leave. So yeah, thank you all for comparing these, saying they're very similar. So what do we think of when someone says you should just leave? What does that phrase kind of make us think and feel now that we've done this exercise? Is it ever that easy? Is it ever that simple? Yeah, that person doesn't understand the complexities. They don't know the whole situation. If one's self is degraded, it's harder to make a decision to leave. Absolutely. It's a lot harder to do the right thing for yourself. If you don't even believe that you are worth having a healthy journey, if you are even worth like having a good life. Yeah. Even if the risks have increased to a dangerous degree, an outside person may see things more clearly. Yeah, what we want for the people that we love or the people that we have a connection to, even just people that we work with, our clients, absolutely, we want the best for them. And sometimes it can be really difficult for those people to see things the same way. It's a summed up answer, but there are many nuances. Absolutely. So that's the biggest thing to emphasize here. It's never that simple. It's very situationally based, and there are so many nuances. So thank you all. You all absolutely get exactly where we're coming from here. So we're going to move on to sexual violence now, to switch gears a little bit. So I will warn you all once again that this also has statistics that may be triggering, and information that may be triggering, but the way that we define sexual violence is it's any sexual contact from one person directed at another without their consent. And consent must be clear, coherent, freely given, and ongoing. So what do we say when I'm going to go through each of these terms in turn? So I want someone or a couple people to give me just a quick little answer. What do we mean when we say clear? What do we think clear means when we're talking about consent? Direct. Okay. Understood. Yeah. So clear just means, yeah, verbal, uncoerced, yes. Yeah. And a lot of these are overlapping with one another. So some of them will kind of touch on both concepts, but clear, absolutely. It just means something that does not have ambiguity or nuance. It's clear. It's well understood by both parties. Absolutely. Coherent. What about coherent? Coherent has a couple of different dimensions to it. So give me one of them. Give me all of them. What could coherent mean? Not intoxicated. That's one of them. Yep. Absolutely. Not under the influence of any kind of substance. So that is drugs, alcohol, anything that could cloud someone's judgment or make them not in their right state of mind. Not being intoxicated. What about being awake and conscious? Another dynamic of coherence, or like another dimension, is folks who are able to give consent. Yeah, able to understand what they're consenting to. So people who are mentally impaired or a minor, that is absolutely correct. So folks who are minors do not have the brain capacity to understand what they're consenting to. So whether or not a minor gives consent, it is never consent when it's coming from someone who is under the age of consent, which is different in different places. But in Kentucky, it is 16. Um, so yeah, someone who is under the age of consent cannot give consent. Also, someone who has developmental difficulties, maybe a mental or physical, like something that puts them not in the right frame of mind to fully understand what they're consenting to, that is absolutely not consent. Also, someone who may be in their right frame of mind normally or who is developed enough to understand it, but is having an acute mental health crisis. So, something like a manic or psychotic episode that makes them not their normal self, doesn't give them control of their faculties fully. Absolutely. What about freely given? We've already touched on this a little bit. Not coerced. Yeah, uncoerced. In the shelter system, whether or not a client is capable of giving consent is an inherently unequal relationship. That's true. That is very true. Yes, consent is not as easy in practice as it is in theory. So absolutely there are sometimes folks who are in unequal relationships, even if someone is capable of giving consent. Doesn't always make them able to consent. in a way that is not coerced or forced in some other kind of way. So absolutely, when the relationship is unequal, oftentimes there can be issues with consent. Enthusiastic, yes, that is absolutely right. Enthusiastic, yes. So freely given means not coerced, and the person will respect someone saying no just as much as they will respect that person saying yes. So not feeling like if you say no that you're in some kind of danger. Ongoing. What about ongoing? Oh, equal power dynamic. Nothing is withheld or given to them in exchange for sex. Okay. That gets into more complicated conversations about things like sex work, but there, yes, like a quid pro quo type of relationship where something is not truly consensual, but it's for an exchange that someone needs, or some kind of like power dynamic. That is absolutely true. What about ongoing? So when we say ongoing, we mean that consent for, oh, yeah, yeah. Once they say no to stop, that's absolutely true. And continued yes throughout. So both of those are very, very true. They're the same, two sides of the same coin. So yes, it needs to be a continued yes throughout. And once they say no, absolutely stop. So ongoing means that consent to one activity doesn't necessarily mean consent to another. And if one partner wants to do something that wasn't talked about or agreed to beforehand, stopping and asking, having a frank conversation about that, where there's no coercion or begging or force of any kind, there's no exchange of goods. But yeah, absolutely. So having that ongoing conversation and also establishing that a relationship or a like previous sexual encounter is not consent for sex in the future, or for any kind of like sexual contact. So just being married to someone is not consent. Being someone's partner is not consent. Or like having regularly checking in. Absolutely. Regularly checking in with someone, ensuring consent rather than just assuming it. So yeah, we're gonna show a little short video here that I hope will work. If it doesn't, it's not the end of the world, but it's a little metaphor for consent. I want y'all to be watching this critically and thinking about it as you watch. Not just taking it at face value, but tell me afterwards, after we watch it, I want y'all to tell me a little bit of your thoughts. So be thinking about your thoughts as we watch.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe. because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Right, so I would like to hear a little from you all about maybe what you think about the video, what you were thinking while you were watching, general reactions. What do we think?
If you're
No obligations? Okay, yeah. Am I just seeing that from earlier? No, that's from now. Okay. Yeah, no obligations. What else do we think about that video? Maybe that metaphor. Useful, not useful? Showing a kind gesture does not mean a yes? Yeah, absolutely. Now, I asked you all a lot of general thoughts, so I'm giving people some time to type it out. Might be a little bit of a longer response here, which is a-okay. Do we think that tea is a good metaphor or analogy for consent when it comes to sex? So I want you all to kind of be thinking about, as much as that might be a helpful metaphor, as much as it's a good baseline understanding of consent, the ways that we have to condense a consent conversation that is maybe a little uncomfortable at times, maybe talks about some topics that are taboo into something that's cute and funny, just so that we can digest it and understand it fully. So I want you all to kind of be reflecting on that. Says quite a lot about our society, doesn't it? That we have to condense that conversation into something funny and digestible for people to get it. And that we have to simplify consent when it should be as simple as when people say or non-verbally communicate that they don't want to have sex or they're not comfortable, that we shouldn't try to have sex with them. So I just want you all to be thinking and reflecting on that. I'm gonna share some stats now, and I will warn you all once again that these might be triggering. I think that the video is saying just because had sex yesterday or last week that a person wants it every time. Yeah, absolutely. That just because having a prior history with someone doesn't mean giving consent. Yeah, which can be true about a lot of things, not just sex, but also tea and other offers like that. Yeah. Using a tea analogy broke it down to how simple a concept it should be. Yeah, it gets everyone out of our mindset of thinking of consent as like really complex, or thinking of it. It can be nuanced, but oftentimes people use the nuances of consent as an excuse for like behavior that is not consensual. So yeah, breaking it down to showing how simple it really should be, to understand if someone's consenting or not. Yeah, so I'm going to share a few stats now. And just please take care of yourselves as I read these. Step away if you need to. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. And every 9 minutes, that person is a child. Over half of women have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during her lifetime. And almost 1 in 3 men have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during his lifetime. So what we mean when we say sexual violence involving physical contact is anything that involves like groping all the way up to rape, with other kinds of like sexual assault sitting in the middle of that. And the reason that we say sexual violence involving physical contact is that there are other kinds of sexual violence that don't include contact. So things like verbal harassment or different kinds of like harassment or non-consensual interactions, pictures or videos that happen in the online space. So those are a little more difficult to track, a little more abstract, and unfortunately, those kinds of things would make these numbers even higher. So over half of women just physical contact sexual violence, and almost 1 in 3 men. So those numbers are probably a lot higher if we think of all the different kinds of sexual violence that could happen to someone. So what do we think about these statistics? And we've been together a little over an hour now. So to put that in perspective, just since we have been together in this space, that's about 60 people. Any thoughts that you all want to share? Anything that these statistics might make us think or feel? I know these ones are upsetting to hear. These ones are my least favorite ones to share in a presentation. It's shocking just how frequently this happens. Yeah. Even knowing from our anecdotal experiences, just how many people this happens to in our lives, how many clients might disclose things like this to us, it's still even higher than that, because the reality is a lot of people don't feel comfortable telling someone else. They don't feel comfortable reporting. And a lot of people sometimes don't even understand that something happened to them until after the fact. Yeah. Even more frequent than what we might think or know just from our experiences. So we can switch gears now a little bit and talk about rape culture. So I'd like someone to give me a guess on what rape culture means, or give me your understanding of it from like pop culture. This is probably a term that y'all have heard bandied about at some point. So absolutely no wrong answers. Just give me a thought on what it might mean. Just hazard a guess for me. So a thought on what we mean when we say rape culture. Patterns, behavior, and stigma. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody want to say anything else? Any more on any of those things, maybe? So when we say rape culture, we are defining it as a society that trivializes or normalizes assault and gender-based violence. And we have our fancy little pyramid here of what that can look like. So just like a real pyramid, the things that happen on the bottom are the building blocks for the things that happen at the top. So It's worthwhile to mention that any kind of sexual violence or assault is damaging. It is no more or less severe or impactful for the person experiencing it. But we do have kind of a general like kind of progression of how these things happen. So they start out with things that maybe we will hear or experience sometimes that seem kind of innocuous. So some of the sexist attitudes, jokes about like a woman should be in the kitchen or whatever, locker room banter or like discussion of like gender and misogyny, objectification of people. Then it goes up to things like stalking, unsolicited pictures, catcalling, or like unwanted non-sexual touch. So that's like a violation of consent that is not sexual. Yeah, part of the privilege mindset. Absolutely. So this intersects a lot with our discussion of using privilege when it comes to intimate partner violence. And just as a reminder, sexual violence can also be a component of intimate partner violence or a component of relationships that two people have through like acquaintanceship or some other kind of like power or authority, or also like a family relationship. So absolutely a part of the privilege mindset, and people can use privilege to enforce like sexual violence in the same way that they can with intimate partner violence. Yeah. So it goes up the pyramid here into threats, into coercion, and victim blaming and shaming. So the more that we don't believe victims and survivors' stories, the more that things like this are allowed to continue. And then it goes up into the behaviors that are even on the top part of the pyramid. I hesitate to say worse because there is no such thing as worse, but the things that are at least taken and conceived of as more severe, condom or like contraceptive sabotage, molestation, drugging, and rape. So the things at the top of the pyramid wouldn't be allowed to happen if the things at the bottom of the pyramid were being called out, were being punished, and were quite honestly being stigmatized. So people having those like social reward systems in place for saying things like that and other people joining in with them or laughing at jokes that aren't appropriate. Those are the things that justify and trivialize and normalize these behaviors. So as we talked about victim blaming, we're going to go into a little bit of how not to contribute to rape culture and not to do some of those victim blaming things. We can do them accidentally sometimes, and that's okay. If you've done that before, leave that in the past. It's okay, but we can do better in the future. So here are some ways to better support survivors and how to respond when someone discloses trauma. First thing that we want to do is slow down and remember the simple human response to tragedy. So we want to slow down. Our minds might be racing when someone discloses something to us. We might be thinking about what to say or what to do. But in that moment, we need to take a deep breath and remember to respond to that person with empathy and with human connection. So what that can look like is saying things like, I believe you. Thank you for telling me. Someone was really brave to share their story with you. Saying you were brave to share that with me and I'm proud of you. Something like you did nothing wrong, which is a direct counter to victim blaming narratives. And saying I'm here to help and I care about you. So showing someone that they have support. It is a huge mitigating factor in someone's reactions to and like ability to bounce back from trauma is if the first person that they share with believes them, validates them, and genuinely listens and supports them, they have a much higher chance of returning to like normal functionality, better mental and emotional states, versus if the first person doesn't believe them or validate them, they feel shamed. They feel like they have to bottle that trauma up. And oftentimes it gets worse and leads to more unhealthy coping mechanisms, and a higher risk of further victimization. So the first step is always validating and believing. But we also want to refrain from asking a lot of questions. We want to give someone space to share what they want to share. If we are going to ask them some questions, the most important ones that we can ask them are what kind of support they need and who can support them or how can we support them. So sometimes you might be not the right person for supporting them in the way they need. So discussing with them and having a collaborative discussion about who would be the best person to support them in their situation. And listening without skepticism or judgment, a confusing account is most likely the evidence of trauma. So when someone is disclosing to us, especially as service providers, but also just as people in our normal lives, we are not police or investigators, or we're not trying to get to the bottom of what really happened. If someone is telling us something, that is their truth in that moment. That is genuinely what they believe happened to them. And if something doesn't sound quite right, or if it sounds kind of confusing and like they're missing a lot of details or like not telling a story chronologically and backtracking a lot, and you might think to yourself, I'm not sure if they're telling me something that really happened or if they're confused. What we know about trauma is it affects our brain's way of coding memory. So our brain doesn't code memory the same way it normally does, and it's much harder to remember something chronologically. It's much harder to remember something in a way that would make sense to tell it to someone else, especially if it's our first time disclosing to someone. So, excuse me. So trauma makes our brains not remember things the same way we normally do. And our accounts might sound confusing to someone else, even if they're completely true. Also, sometimes trauma, like intimate partner and sexual violence, is happening over multiple months or years. And it's difficult to remember what order things happened in when we're trying to tell a story that happened over the course of a long amount of time. So, giving those people grace and validating and believing them no matter what. So when we're thinking about trauma and when we're thinking about responding to someone who is going through something, it's never what's wrong with you. Even if someone is escalated, shouting, or they're on the opposite end of the spectrum and they're completely stoic and removed, we're never trying to think what's wrong with that person. We're trying to think what happened to that person. So how you say things is more important than what you say. You're never going to say the one right thing to help someone and solve all their problems. And really, we shouldn't be trying to fix things for them in the first place. But how you say things and the supportive mannerisms that you have and the way that you make someone feel is much more important than the actual substance of the words that you're saying. It's difficult to remember, but in these moments, it's not about us. It's not about experiences we've been through. It's not about how hearing their trauma is making us feel. But it's about holding space for that person and giving them the opportunity to share what happened to them. So it's not even about our understanding necessarily. That's why we don't want to ask a lot of questions, because we're not trying to understand for our own sake. The only reason we want to understand is to better support them. So giving them the space to say what they need to say, listen to understand, not to respond. So that goes back to active listening and listening with the intention of truly getting to someone's true emotions and feelings behind what's going on, rather than just trying to fix their problem or better, like, figure them. So no shaming or victim blaming, not saying things like, what were you wearing? Or like, why were you out with those people? Or even things that we might think are helpful or that are trying to get to the bottom of their story might come off as victim blaming. So finding different ways to phrase questions if we do need to gather information from them. And also giving them those open-ended questions like, tell me about the night, tell me about what happened. So holding as much space for them as we can, giving them the time that we're able to offer them, and giving them access to us if they need us at some point in the future, keeping in mind our own boundaries, professional and personal, but holding space for them to whatever degree is appropriate and healthy for all parties involved. And knowing the resources. So that's where we come in. So at the center, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about what we have to offer. We have a 24-hour crisis and information line. So that's the best way to get a hold of anyone at the center and get connected with any of our services is to call that number. That is 24/7. And crisis sounds kind of like a barrier to a lot of people, but crisis doesn't necessarily mean someone is actively going through a crisis. It could mean that they had something that triggered like a memory and is making them feel like emotionally activated at that moment. They can call us for crisis counseling. So some of the things we do on that crisis line are safety planning with folks who are in an abusive situation or leaving an abusive situation or both. Folks who don't even plan to leave at all, but who want to stay safer in their situation. We also have referrals to other community resources, depending on what the person needs. Yes, the clinical necessity of being supportive and the legal requirement to notify can come into conflict in some situations when trauma is disclosed. Yes, it's best practices or is how we train our folks to let someone know up front that we're a mandated reporter so that they can have a choice of what they want to disclose to us. But yes, absolutely. Sometimes we do run into that. And what we advise folks to do and how we train our people is to have a collaborative experience with the survivor to discuss with them. First of all, to notify them that we're a mandated reporter at the beginning of the conversation, wherever possible. But if they do disclose something, to let them know what the process is going to look like for reporting, to involve them in that and not to just do it, to tell them like, we need to make this report. Do you want to make it with me? Do you want to sit in while I make this report? And trying to give them some of the agency that, again, like folks who are in abusive situations have had agency and control taken away from them. So even though we are mandated to report and our hands are tied in that situation, giving them a little bit of a window into that process and giving them some of the agency to like see what that looks like and collaborate with us as we make that report is something that can mitigate that. But really the best thing to do is tell people up front that we're mandated reporters. So absolutely, that's a great point to bring up. So on our crisis line, we have safety planning, referrals, we do counseling. So just like counseling someone through a situation, through what they're going through, what their thoughts and feelings might be. And we also have a language line that is like a third-party phone translator that we can loop into any of our conversations. So for anyone who speaks any language, we can give them services. We have a short-term emergency shelter that holds about 80 people. We also have long-term housing advocacy, so we can't guarantee anyone housing, but we do our best to work with folks to get some kind of long-term housing or to get them set up for housing if and when they're either leaving their abuser or leaving shelter. We also have legal advocacy, so the same as with housing advocacy, these folks are not lawyers, but they understand the legal process. They can give someone an overview of what the process looks like. They can't give legal advice, but they can give a lot of tips and tricks into the process and what the legal system looks like, especially in relation to protective orders, or they're often called restraining orders. We also have hospital advocacy. So once again, these are folks who go to the hospital with someone, kind of literally and figuratively hold their hand through the process of what can be really difficult, getting a SAFE exam, which is a sexual assault forensic exam for collection of evidence when someone has been sexually assaulted. So we have our advocates who go to the hospital and who talk someone through that process and support them as they need or would like. We also have an on-site SAFE clinic. So we have a 24/7 nurse on call that can come perform those exams in our clinic on our campus. So a little less hubbub and commotion than going to the emergency room at like 3 a.m. So that is often an option that's a little calmer and feels a little more safe oftentimes for folks. So we do offer that on our campus. We also have immigrant and refugee advocacy. So supporting folks who need to have documentation separated from their abuser, or who need any kind of support or assistance when it comes to immigration. We have therapy specific to sexual assault. That is just because of the way that our grant funding works, that we are not able to offer domestic violence therapy at the moment, but we do have therapy for sexual assault. We have case management for both sexual assault and domestic violence. So the difference in therapy and case management is therapy focuses on our past and kind of how it manifests in our present. So kind of how we got to where we are, processing and unpacking. And case management focuses more on our present and our future. So getting things like housing, some of our more material needs, but the overlap of both is some counseling, some understanding of grounding techniques and like healthy coping mechanisms, understanding our triggers and how to keep ourselves safe the best. So both of those services they're kind of like on a Venn diagram of they have some overlap, but they also are very distinct. So we have support groups and we also have art therapy that we offer for sexual assault. And then we have some great community partnerships too that we always like to highlight are with the Humane Society. So we have a small shelter space on our campus for folks who need to bring pets with them. Those pets can stay in that small shelter space for 72 hours, but after that point has come and gone, the Humane Society takes them in and takes care of them, places them with a great foster family, takes care of all of their food and any of their vet care or needs that they might have while that person is in shelter with us. And then when they get out of shelter into whatever their housing situation looks like afterwards, they can either pick up their pet and get their pet back with them, or if their situation no longer allows for them to have a pet, then the Humane Society will place them up for adoption. And all of that is free of charge. So all of the pet's care, everything they might need, all of their shots and vaccinations, everything is completely free of charge for that individual. And we also have a community partnership with TARC, where if anyone steps on a TARC bus and says, I need a ride to safety, they will get that person, again, free of charge to the center. And they can also just say, I need to get to the center, and they know what that means. But the program is called Ride to Safety, and that is kind of the code word. So we also do awareness and prevention, which is what I'm doing right now, and that is my position. So tabling, any kinds of like brochures and materials. We also have little cards that have all of our information on them. I have one of them here. This one is in Spanish, but they are little purple cards that fold down and can be placed in a wallet really easily. They have our phone number on the back, and they have some of our other information about like what we do in the middle of them. So we can drop off those cards and get them to folks if people want to have those to like hand out really easily. So we have an email that will be at the end of this presentation if you ever want or need anything from us. And we have a 9-county service area. So Jefferson, Bullitt, Shelby, Trimble, Oldham, Henry Spencer, and in Indiana, Floyd and Clark. So the best way to refer someone is through our crisis line, which is 502-581-7222. Or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline if you need to. You tell them you're in the Louisville area and they will route you to us. So that is all. This is our contact info for trainings, brochures and materials, any kinds of tabling or awareness activities. And you can also call the crisis line. And thank you all. Thank you all so much. And if you all have any questions or anything that you need to comment, feel free to say that, drop it in the chat, or you can send anything that you need or want to that email, and I will be the one to answer it. Yeah, thank you all.
All right, we are at 1:33 here. You have given us a wealth of information. Rachel, thank you so much for giving us some time this afternoon. A reminder to everybody, there should be a survey that pops up. I encourage you to take that. We at the coalition do read those surveys and take your comments into consideration when we plan future trainings. So I encourage you to do that. Rachel, if you will send me the slides, I will make sure that everybody gets copies of those. And then In a few days, the recording will be up on the coalition's website. So if you want to go back and rewatch it or share it with somebody that wasn't able to attend today, it will be available. So thank you all, and I will let you go about your afternoons now. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. And just a reminder, if you all want any materials or if you are part of other community organizations that you think would benefit from a presentation like this, please send it to that email and I will be happy to come give you all anything that you would like. And thank you all so much for your time and your attention and your participation. I appreciate it a ton.